Alright everyone, settle in for tonight's exploration. We're veering off the well-trodden path of heroic westerns and stepping into something a touch more unvarnished. Prepare for a deep dive not into celebrated triumphs of manifest destiny but into the forgotten toil and the everyday grit of life for a pioneer family on the 19th century American prairie. That glossy version of history you've seen in movies, all rugged cowboys and quaint log cabins against a golden sunset, well, the unvarnished truth was often a far cry, and frankly, your modern comforts would feel like a distant, unimaginable dream. So find your coziest spot. If you appreciate a journey into the raw, unfiltered past, a like on the video would be fantastic, and do consider subscribing for more of these historical reality checks. As always, I'm curious to know where you're joining us from tonight. Drop a comment with your location and time. It's always a highlight seeing our global community. Okay, perhaps dim those lights, let a soft ambient sound fill the room, and let's embark on tonight's rather sobering journey together. Your dream begins not with a wide-open vista, but with a cramped, overloaded wagon in St. Louis. You have sold everything you own for this wagon, a team of oxen, and the promise of free land out west. The wagon is packed to the brim with your life's possessions, a plow, sacks of seed, a few tools, bedding, and barrels of food. There is no room for comfort. You and your family will walk alongside the wagon for the better part of 2,000 miles. The journey itself, the famous Oregon Trail, is not an adventure. It is a months-long funeral procession where the graves are often left unmarked on the vast, indifferent prairie. The romantic notion of a trail of discovery dies within the first week. The greatest danger on the trail is not from bandits or hostile natives, as the dime novels would have you believe. It is from disease. The campsites are crowded and unsanitary. The water sources are often contaminated by the thousands of people and animals who have passed before you. Cholera is rampant. It is a swift and merciless killer. A person can be healthy at breakfast and dead by dusk, their body racked by violent vomiting and diarrhea. You watch other families bury their loved ones, wrapping them in a simple blanket and digging a shallow grave that will likely be uncovered by wolves. Every sip of water is a gamble. You live in a state of constant, low-grade terror of a sickness you cannot see or fight. Accidents are a daily occurrence. A child falls from the wagon and is crushed beneath its iron-rimmed wheels. A man is kicked in the head by an ox or accidentally shoots himself while cleaning his rifle. River crossings are particularly terrifying. There are no bridges. You must ford the rushing, unpredictable currents. Wagons overturn, and people and precious livestock are swept away and drowned. Your life savings, your tools, your future, all can be lost in a matter of moments to the indifferent power of the river. The trail is littered with the abandoned belongings of those who came before, a testament to broken dreams and shattered hopes. You pass furniture, heavy trunks, even pianos, jettisoned to lighten the load for exhausted animals. After months of grueling travel, you finally arrive at your claim. The free land granted by the Homestead Act is a vast, empty expanse of grassland stretching to the horizon. There are no trees for lumber, no friendly neighbors, no town. There is only the sky, the grass, and the ceaseless, maddening wind. The wind is your constant companion. It howls day and night, a lonely, oppressive sound that frays your nerves. It whips dust into your eyes, your food, and your bedding. The silence you dreamed of is a lie. The prairie has its own form of relentless, soul-crushing noise. This is your promised land, a flat, featureless void that you are expected to tame. Your first home is not a charming log cabin. The prairie lacks trees. Your home will be a soddy, a house you build yourself from the very earth you stand on. You cut the prairie sod, thick with tangled grass roots, into heavy brick. You stack them to build walls. The roof is made of more sod laid over a thin frame of brushwood, or the precious few pieces of lumber you could afford. It is dark, damp, and smells of earth and mildew. The dirt floor becomes a muddy puddle when it rains, and it always rains inside your sod. The roof leaks constantly, dripping a slow, steady stream of muddy water onto your bed, your table, and into your food. Your new home is not just yours, it is shared with a menagerie of unwelcome guests. The sod walls are a perfect habitat for fleas, lice, and spiders. Snakes, mice, and gophers burrow through the walls and floor. It is not uncommon to wake up with a snake sharing your bed for warmth or to have dirt and centipedes drop from the ceiling onto your dinner plate. You learn to check your boots for scorpions in the morning. Your life is a constant battle against the small creeping, crawling things that view your home as their own. The line between indoors and outdoors is hopelessly, disgustingly blurred. The work of breaking the prairie is a form of physical torture. The sod is a dense, tangled mat of roots that has grown undisturbed for thousands of years. Your simple iron plow, pulled by your exhausted oxen, can barely scratch its surface. The labor is back-breaking, repetitive, and seemingly endless. From sunrise to sunset, you walk behind the plow, your muscles screaming in protest. your hands blistered and bleeding. It can take an entire week to plow a single acre, and you have 160 acres to tame. Every inch of your new farm is earned through sweat, pain, and a level of physical exertion that borders on self-destruction. The weather on the prairie is a character in a Greek tragedy, a force of extreme and violent mood swing. The summers are scorching hot, with a relentless sun that bakes the ground into a cracked, barren wasteland. Drought can last for months, withering your precious crops in the field and turning your dreams to dust. The winters are the opposite extreme. Blizzards can appear with terrifying speed, a wall of white that reduces visibility to zero and drops temperatures to deadly lows. You can get lost simply walking from your house to the barn. Families freeze to death in their own homes, their meager fuel supplies exhaust. Perhaps the most terrifying elemental threat is the prairie fire. In the dry late summer, a single spark from a passing train or a lightning strike can ignite the vast sea of ground. The fire moves faster than a horse can run, a roaring wall of flame, hundreds of feet high, that consumes everything in its path. You have minutes to react. You try to create a fire break, plowing a strip of earth around your home, but it's often a futile gesture. You huddle with your family in a dugout or a well, praying the fire will pass you by. The sound is a deafening roar, the heat is intense, and the air is thick with smoke. It is an apocalyptic, terrifying force of nature. Then there are the locusts. Not just a few grasshoppers, but a biblical plague. They arrive as a great, dark cloud on the horizon that blots out the sun, the sound of their wings, a low, menacing hum. Then they descend. In a matter of hours they can devour every green thing for miles around. They eat the crops in your field, the leaves from the few trees you have managed to grow, the wool from your sheep's back, the very clothes off your back, and even the wooden handle of your plow. When they leave, the landscape is as barren as if it had been burned. They leave behind a stench of decay and a profound, crushing sense of utter helplessness. Your diet is monotonous and bleak. The dream of a self-sufficient farm is years away. For the first few years your diet consists of what you could bring and what little you can grow or hunt. Cornbread, salt pork and potatoes are the staples. You eat the same thing day after day, week after week. Fresh vegetables are a rare luxury. Meat comes from the occasional rabbit or prairie chicken you manage to shoot. You are in a constant state of low-level malnutrition, always hungry, always craving something different. The bounty of the land is a cruel myth. The land gives very little, and it makes you work for every single scrap. Finding clean water is a constant struggle. You dig a well by hand, a dangerous and exhausting task. The water you find is often brackish and alkaline, tasting foul and causing stomach ailments. In times of drought your well may run dry, forcing you to haul water for miles from the nearest river or stream. That water is often contaminated by animal waste, a breeding ground for typhoid and dysentery. Like your ancestors on the trail, every drink is a risk. A simple glass of clean, cool water is a luxury you dream about with an intensity you never thought possible. One of the most insidious enemies you face is loneliness. You are miles from your nearest neighbor. You can go for weeks or even months without seeing another human being outside of your immediate family. The vast, empty landscape, which at first seemed liberating, becomes a prison. The silence, punctuated only by the howling wind, is deafening. Men and women alike succumb to prairie madness, a form of severe depression caused by the profound isolation. They become withdrawn, paranoid, and sometimes violent. The human mind is not built for this kind of emptiness. Medical care is non-existent. There are no doctors. If you have a severe accident, like a broken leg or a deep gash from an axe, there is no one to help you. You rely on folk remedies, poultices made of plants, and a good deal of prayer. Childbirth is a terrifying, life-threatening event. With no medical assistance, the mortality rate for both mothers and infants is tragically high. A simple infection from a rusty nail, a toothache, a case of pneumonia. Any of these can be a death sentence. You live with the constant awareness of your own physical fragility in a world with no safety net. Let's de-romanticize the cowboy. You decide you can't make it as a farmer and sign on for a cattle drive. It is not a life of adventure and freedom. It is a life of low pay, long hours, and mind-numbing boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. You spend months in the saddle, driving thousands of cattle across the plains. You endure scorching heat, freezing rain, and violent thunderstorms. The food is monotonous: beef, beans, and coffee. The greatest fear is a stampede, a thundering, unstoppable wave of panicked cattle that can trample a man to death in seconds. You are not a hero, you are a poorly paid itinerant farmhand on horseback. The famous gunfights of the Old West are largely violence was common, but it was rarely a noble duel at high noon. It was usually a messy, drunken affair, a brawl that ended with a knife in the gut or a bullet in the back. Law and order in the boom towns was often administered by vigilante committees, which were little more than organized lynch mobs. Justice was swift, brutal, and often misplaced. The man with the quickest draw was less important than the man with the most friends, or the least scruple. The reality of Western violence was ugly, pathetic, and deeply personal. The relationship with Native American tribes is not a simple story of good versus evil. From your perspective as a settler, driven by the belief in manifest destiny, they are an obstacle, a savage force to be removed. You live in fear of raids, of losing your livestock or your life. You do not see the larger picture, that you are an invader, a squatter on land that has been theirs for generations. You are part of a relentless wave of settlement that is destroying their way of life, breaking treaties, and pushing them towards extinction. The conflict is born of desperation on both sides, a clash of two worlds, where there can be no peaceful resolution. Building your community is a slow and arduous process. A small town might eventually spring up a day's ride from your homestead. It consists of a general store, a saloon, and perhaps a blacksmith. The general store is your lifeline. Here you can trade your meager crops for necessities like salt, sugar, coffee, and cloth, but you are at the mercy of the store owner's prices. You often have to buy on credit, falling into a cycle of debt that is difficult to escape. The town is not a symbol of progress, it is a symbol of your dependence on a system that is designed to profit from your labor. The role of women on the frontier is one of endless, unacknowledged toil. A pioneer woman's work is never done. She is responsible for cooking, cleaning, and laundry, all without any modern conveniences. She tends the garden, raises the poultry, and preserves food for the long winter. She makes the family's clothes, candles, and soap. She is the doctor, the teacher, and the emotional anchor of the family. And she does all this while also helping with the farm work, and bearing and raising numerous children in incredibly dangerous conditions. The frontier was not won by rugged men alone, it was built on the silent, back-breaking labor of women. Let's consider the simple act of doing laundry. It is an all-day affair. You have to haul water from the well, bucket by bucket, and heat it over an open fire. You scrub the clothes on a washboard with harsh lye soap that eats away at your skin. You then have to rinse them and wring them out by hand, a physically demanding task. Finally, you hang them on a line to dry, where they are immediately beset by the prairie dust and wind. A clean shirt is a luxury that requires a full day of exhausting labor. The cozy log cabin of myth was, in reality, a difficult and often poorly constructed shelter. If you were lucky enough to settle in a wooded area, you had to fell the trees yourself, a monumental task. The logs were heavy and difficult to move. The gaps between the logs were chinked with mud and moss, which constantly crumbled and fell out, letting in wind, rain, and snow. The cabin was dark, with only one or two small windows, and often had a dirt floor just like a soddy. It was an improvement over a sod house, but it was still a far cry from the comfortable, charming image of popular culture. The psychological toll of this life is immense. The combination of crushing labor, constant anxiety about weather and crops, poor nutrition, and profound loneliness wears you down. You become weathered, not just on the outside, but on the inside. Hope is a resource that dwindles with each failed crop, each sick animal, each new hardship. You see your neighbors give up, their spirits broken, abandoning their claims and heading back east, defeated. Survival is not just a physical struggle, it is a daily battle for your own sanity. The pests that plague your farm are a constant source of misery. Gophers and prairie dogs dig up your fields, destroying the root systems of your crops. Rabbits devour your vegetable garden. Coyotes and wolves prey on your chickens and calves. And then there are the insects. Besides the locusts, there are swarms of biting flies and mosquitoes that make working outside in the summer a form of torture for both you and your livestock. You are in a constant war with a million tiny enemies, a war you can never truly win. The idea of social status is flattened on the frontier, but not eliminated. Your worth is measured in sheer endurance. Can you survive the winter? Can you bring in a crop? Can you raise a family in this God-forsaken place? A successful farmer, one who manages to build a wooden house and a large barn, becomes a respected figure. But this success is fragile. A single hailstorm, a prairie fire, or a plague of locusts can wipe out years of hard work in an instant, reducing you back to the level of a desperate beginner. You are always just one disaster away from ruin. The education of your children is a major concern. There are no schools. You or your spouse must teach them to read and write, often at the end of a long day of labor, by the dim light of a kerosene lamp. You have few books, perhaps a Bible and a tattered almanac. You know that without an education, your children's future is limited, likely to be a repeat of your own life of hard physical labor. This adds another layer of anxiety to your already burdened existence. The simple joy of a varied meal is a distant memory. For months on end, your world tastes of corn, salt, and bacon grease. You dream of fruit, of fresh greens, of a piece of bread that isn't hard and dense. When your garden finally produces, a fresh tomato or a sweet melon is a cause for celebration, a burst of flavor in a world of bland monotony. The scarcity of these simple pleasures makes them incredibly precious. You learn that luxury is not gold or silk, but the taste of a ripe strawberry. The boom towns that spring up around a gold or silver strike are not centers of opportunity. They are cesspools of greed and desperation. They are slapped-together collections of tents and wooden shacks, filled with prospectors, gamblers, prostitutes and conmen. The sanitation is non-existent, and disease runs rampant. The violence is endemic. For every man who strikes it rich, 1,000 others end up broke, sick, or dead. The boomtown is a fever dream, a place that promises wealth but delivers misery to the vast majority of its inhabitants. The railroad, the great symbol of progress, is a double-edged sword. It brings supplies and allows you to ship your crops to market, but it also sets the shipping rates, and you are at the mercy of its monopolistic power. It brings more settlers, increasing the competition for resources, and it is the railroad that often brings the sparks that ignite the devastating prairie fires. It is an engine of change, but you are not in the driver's seat. You are just a small farmer, trying not to get crushed under its iron wheels. Let's consider the tools you use. They are simple, heavy, and unforgiving. The axe, the scythe, the walking plow. There are no machines to help you. Every task is accomplished through sheer muscle power. An injury from one of these tools can be crippling. A slip of an axe can mean a severed artery or a shattered bone, a death sentence, when the nearest doctor is 100 miles away. Your tools are your partners in survival, but they are also a constant source of danger. The winter isolation is a unique form of torment. You are snowed in for months. The world outside your small home is a vast, white and silent expanse. You are trapped with your own family in a tiny cramped space. Tempers fray. The same faces, the same stories, day after day. The lack of stimulation and the sensory deprivation can lead to a profound sense of despair. This is the cabin fever of lore, a very real psychological condition, born of cold, darkness and confinement. The legal system is a distant and often irrelevant concept. If your neighbor's cattle trample your crops, or if there is a dispute over a boundary line, there is no court to appeal to. You must settle the matter yourselves, either through negotiation, or more often with threats and intimidation. The concept of property rights is only as strong as your ability to defend your property with a rifle. You are your own law, a fact that is both liberating and terrifying. The livestock you depend on are as vulnerable as you are. A harsh winter can kill your oxen. A disease can sweep through your chickens. A wolf can take your only milk cow. Each loss is a devastating blow, not just financially, but emotionally. These animals are not pets, but they are your partners in this struggle for survival. Their well-being is directly tied to your own, and their death brings you one step closer to failure. The general store in the nearest town is a place of both hope and dread. It is your only link to the wider world, a place where you can get news and supplies. The storekeeper is often the most powerful man in the community. He is your banker, your postmaster, and your supplier. He knows who is succeeding and who is failing. He extends you credit when your crops fail, but this kindness comes at a price. You become indebted to him, bound by a financial relationship that reinforces his power and your vulnerability. The birth of a child is a moment of both joy and extreme terror. With no doctor or midwife, the woman is attended by her husband or female neighbors, if any are close enough to help. The process is fraught with danger. Complications that would be minor today were often fatal. Postpartum infection, or childbed fever, was a common killer of new mothers. Every successful birth feels like a miracle, a small victory against the overwhelming odds of this harsh environment. The landscape itself, the endless, rolling prairie, has a profound psychological effect. It is a world without landmarks, without verticality. The sheer scale of it can make a person feel tiny, insignificant, and exposed. There is nowhere to hide. You are always visible, always under the vast, watchful eye of the sky. This can induce a form of agoraphobia, a fear of the very openness that you came here to see. The beautiful vista of the painter is the terrifying void of the settler. Let's revisit the prairie fire from a different perspective. It is not just a threat to your life and home, it is an ecological reset. For generations, Native Americans used fire to manage the plains, to clear old growth and encourage new grass for the buffalo. The fires you fear are often larger and more destructive, because of the very farming practices you employ, which allow for a greater buildup of fuel. In your attempt to tame the land, you have inadvertently made it more dangerous. The cowboy's life on a cattle drive was one of constant exposure. You sleep on the ground, in all weather, with only a thin bedroll for comfort. You are plagued by insects, dust, and the constant smell of cattle. You are in the saddle for 12 to 14 hours a day, your body chafed and sore. The diet is greasy and repetitive, leading to digestive problems. It is a life that wears a man down, leaving him old before his time. The freedom of the open range is the freedom to be uncomfortable, exhausted and poorly paid. The myth of the self-reliant individual is a powerful one, but the reality is that survival on the frontier often depended on cooperation. Neighbors, though far apart, would band together to help with harvests, barn raisings, and in times of crisis. This communal spirit was a necessity, not a choice. The man who tried to go it completely alone was often the first to fail. The true story of the West is not just one of individual grit, but of the small, fragile communities that formed to combat the overwhelming hardships of the environment. The clothing you wear is purely functional. You have one or two sets of clothes, made of durable but rough materials, like canvas or wool. They are patched and repatched until they are more patch than original fabric. They are rarely washed and carry the accumulated smells of sweat, dirt, wood smoke, and livestock. A new piece of clothing from the general store is a major purchase, a luxury to be cherished. There is no thought of fashion, only of durability and warmth. The end of your journey is not a triumphant arrival. It is simply the beginning of a different, more stationary struggle. The dangers of the trail are replaced by the dangers of the farm. The acute crises are replaced by a chronic, grinding hardship. You have reached your destination, but you have not found paradise. You have found a piece of land that will demand everything you have, your strength, your health, your sanity, and in return, it may or may not provide you with a meager existence. The wild animals of the prairie are not majestic symbols of a lost world. They are competitors and threats. The buffalo herds, though dwindling, can trample your crops. The wolves and coyotes that howl at night are not a romantic soundtrack. They are a direct threat to your livestock. The rattlesnakes that live in the prairie dog towns are a deadly menace. You do not live in harmony with nature. You live in a state of constant, low-level warfare with it. The concept of a weekend or a day of rest is a foreign one. Your work is dictated by the seasons and the weather, not by a calendar. There is always a task that needs doing, a fence to mend, a tool to repair, an animal to tend to. Sunday might be a day of less strenuous labor, a day for Bible reading and quiet contemplation, but it is not a day off. The farm is a relentless master, and it does not grant holiday. The towns that do develop are often bleak and ugly. They are collections of false-fronted wooden buildings, thrown up quickly and without any aesthetic consideration. The streets are unpaved, turning to a sea of mud in the rain and a cloud of dust in the dry season. The saloon is the social center, a place of temporary escape, that often leads to violence and poverty. These are not the charming bustling towns of the movies. They are raw, functional, and often depressing outposts of a civilization that feels very far away. The water you drink can carry more than just disease. The high mineral content, particularly alkali, can cause chronic health problems. It can make your hair fall out and cause your teeth to ache. It gives the water a soapy, unpleasant taste. You long for the sweet, clear water you remember from back east. The very foundation of life, water, is here a source of constant discomfort and potential illness. Let's talk about the sheer boredom of this life. The physical hardship is immense, but so is the mental monotony. The landscape rarely changes. The tasks are repetitive. The diet is the same. The conversation is limited. There is little stimulation, little to occupy the mind beyond the immediate, pressing concerns of survival. This crushing boredom can be as damaging as any physical threat, eroding the spirit and leading to a sense of profound hopelessness. The romantic image of the pioneer family gathered around a crackling fire in their cozy cabin is a powerful one. The reality is that your fireplace is poorly constructed and inefficient. It fills the small cabin with smoke that stings your eyes and coats everything with a layer of soot. It consumes a vast amount of fuel, which you have to gather by hand, and it provides very little heat, leaving the corners of the room icy cold while you scorch your face by the fire. It is a source of survival, not of comfort. The journey west was often a one-way trip. You know in your heart that you will likely never see your old home or the family you left behind again. The cost and difficulty of the journey make a return trip impossible. This sense of finality, of a permanent break with your past, is a heavy burden to bear. You are an exile in your own country, a willing participant in a grand experiment that has severed you from your roots. The Native American tribes you encounter are not a monolithic entity. They are diverse peoples with their own cultures, languages, and histories. But in the eyes of the settlers and the government, they are all simply Indians, an obstacle to be managed. You might engage in some trade with a local tribe, but the relationship is fraught with misunderstanding and mistrust. You are living on their land, and both sides know that this arrangement is unstable and likely to end in violence. The coming of the railroad changes everything, but not always for the better. It makes it easier to get supplies, but it also brings a flood of new settlers, driving up the price of land and increasing the competition for resources. It allows you to sell your wheat, but the prices are set by distant markets in Chicago, and the railroad charges whatever it wants to transport it. You are no longer isolated, but you have become a small powerless cog in a vast impersonal, economic machine. If your spouse dies, your situation becomes desperate. A single man cannot run a farm and a household.
A single woman cannot perform the back-breaking labor of the fields. Remarriage is not a matter of romance, it is a matter of pure survival. Widows and widowers often remarry with what seems like unseemly haste, but it is a practical necessity. Your household is a two-person economic unit, and if one part is lost, the other cannot function for long. The beauty of the prairie is real, but it is a harsh, unforgiving beauty. The wildflowers in the spring, the vast, star-filled sky at night, the dramatic thunderstorms that roll across the plains. You might appreciate these moments, but they are always tinged with the knowledge of the land's destructive power. The same sun that makes the flowers grow can also bring a devastating drought. The same sky that holds the beautiful stars can also unleash a deadly blizzard. You learn to view beauty with suspicion. Let's conclude our time on the prairie. You have survived. You have a farm, a family, and a small wooden house that has replaced your original soddy. You have endured drought, blizzards, fires, and plagues. You are a success story, but the cost has been immense. Your body is worn out, your hands are gnarled, and your face is a mask of wrinkles etched by sun and worry. You have traded your youth and your health for this small patch of land. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, in your climate-controlled home, perhaps you can reflect on the true meaning of the pioneer spirit, not the glory of conquest, but the quiet, desperate, and often brutal determination to simply endure.
In the spring of 1846, America was a nation possessed by a dream. It was the dream of the West, a powerful idea known as manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was divinely ordained to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. California was the ultimate prize in this dream, a land portrayed as a near paradise, a place of perpetual sunshine, immense fertility, and boundless opportunity. From across the country, families gathered their belongings, sold their farms, and looked westward, ready to embark on the great 2,000-mile journey along the Oregon Trail. Among those who answered the call that spring was a group of prosperous families from Springfield, Illinois. They were not desperate people fleeing poverty. They were part of the comfortable middle class, seeking to improve their already fortunate lot. Their leaders were two friends and successful businessmen, James Reed and George Donner. They were confident, well-organized, and well-supplied. Their custom-built wagons were sturdy, filled with fine furniture, books, and provisions for the long journey. They drove herds of healthy oxen and cattle. The Donner Party, as they would become known, was a picture of American optimism, setting out to claim their piece of the continental dream. The journey began smoothly. They joined a large wagon train, and for the first few hundred miles, their progress across the vast prairies of Nebraska was steady and uneventful. The daily rhythm of the trail was one of hard work but also of communal spirit. But in late July, as they reached the Little Sandy River in what is now Wyoming, the party came to a crossroads, both literal and metaphorical. Here they had to make a choice. They could continue on the established and well-traveled trail, a long but proven route, or they could take a new advertised shortcut, called the Hastings Cutoff. The cutoff was the brainchild of a man named Lansford Hastings, an ambitious lawyer and promoter who had written a popular guidebook, The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. In his book, Hastings claimed his new route would shave more than 300 miles off the journey. He promised to personally lead those who chose his path. The leaders of the main wagon train were skeptical. They chose to stick to the safe, known route. But James Reed and George Donner, ambitious and eager to make good time, were intrigued. Despite warnings from an old mountain man who knew the territory, they made the fateful decision to split off from the main party and take the unproven shortcut. About 87 men, women, and children followed them into the unknown. The first sign that they had made a catastrophic error came almost immediately. They reached the Weber River Canyon in the Wasatch Mountains of Utah, only to find that the supposed trail was nearly impassable for wagons. Lansford Hastings, who had ridden ahead, had left a note simply advising them that the road was bad, and that they should create a new one. For nearly a month, the men of the Donner Party were forced to become road builders. They spent their days hacking a path through dense aspen forests, clearing boulders, and digging out a track along the steep canyon walls. It was grueling, exhausting work. They lost precious time, their oxen grew weak, and a palpable sense of frustration and anxiety began to settle over the group. The shortcut was already proving to be a long and arduous delay. When they finally emerged from the mountains, they faced an even more terrifying obstacle, the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had described this as a dry, hard-packed plain that could be crossed in 2 days and nights. He was wrong. The desert floor was a soft, salty mud that sucked at the wheels of the heavy wagons, and the heat of the sun was relentless. The crossing, which was supposed to be 40 miles, was closer to 80. The journey became a waking nightmare. The wooden wheels of the wagons shrank in the dry heat, their iron tires falling off. The oxen, crazed with thirst, either bolted into the desert to perish, or simply lay down and died in their yokes. To lighten the loads, the families were forced to abandon their precious possessions, leaving behind chests of drawers, furniture and family heirlooms, to be swallowed by the shimmering salt flats. The crossing took 6 days. When the survivors finally stumbled to the freshwater springs on the other side, they had lost dozens of their cattle. Several wagons were abandoned in the desert, and the party's spirit of cooperation was shattered. They had survived, but they were broken, demoralized, and critically behind schedule. The journey that followed, along the desolate Humboldt River in Nevada, was a slow, grim procession. The grazing for the remaining animals was poor, and more of them weakened and died each day. The party's internal tensions, which had been simmering since the mountains, now boiled over into violence. An argument broke out between James Reed and a teamster named John Snyder. The argument escalated, whips were drawn, and in the ensuing struggle, Reed fatally stabbed Snyder with a hunting knife. The killing horrified the party, though many felt Reed had acted in self-defense. A faction led by a German immigrant named Louis Keseberg demanded he be hanged. Compromise was reached. Reed was banished, cast out of the party to ride ahead alone to California, leaving his wife and children behind to continue with the group. The banishment of one of their most experienced leaders was another devastating blow to the fragile social fabric of the group. By late October, they finally reached the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada, the last great barrier that separated them from the green valleys of California. They were exhausted, their food supplies were dangerously low, and the season was perilously late. They knew they were in a desperate race against the weather. As they began their ascent into the mountains, the first flakes of snow began to fall. The flakes grew thicker, heavier, until it was a full-blown blizzard. They pushed on, but the snow piled up faster than they could clear. Drifts 10 feet deep blocked the pass. They tried to press forward, but their starving animals could go no further. They were forced to retreat a few miles to a nearby lake, a place that would forever after bear their name, Donner Lake. They were trapped just over 100 miles from the safety of Sutter's Fort in California. They were imprisoned by a wall of snow. The winter of 1846-47 would be one of the most severe on record. The Donner Party, scattered in 2 main camps several miles apart, frantically constructed crude shelters against the encroaching winter. The Reed and other families built rough log cabins near the lake, while the Donner families, further back on the trail, set up lean-tos and tents. The snow continued to fall, day after day, week after week. It rose until it was 20 feet deep, burying their cabins, turning their world into a silent white prison. As the weeks turned into months, starvation set in. They ate their remaining cattle, then they ate their dogs. Then they were reduced to eating anything that might provide some meager sustenance. They boiled the hides that had served as roofs for their shelters, creating a foul, glue-like jelly. They ate charred bones, twigs and mud. The social order began to break down, replaced by the primitive, all-consuming reality of hunger. People grew weak, lying in their dark, smoke-filled shelters, listening to the endless howl of the wind, and then, one by one, they began to. By mid-December, it was clear that if they simply waited, they would all perish. A desperate plan was formed. A group of the strongest remaining members, 10 men and 5 women, would attempt to walk out of the mountains on makeshift snowshoes to get help. This group would become known to history as the Forlorn Hope. Their journey was an odyssey of almost unimaginable suffering. The snow was deep and soft. Their snowshoes were clumsy, and they quickly became lost. Their meager rations ran out in a week. Starvation and snow blindness set in. One by one, members of the party weakened and died, and it was here, in the depths of the frozen wilderness, that the final taboo was broken. Stranded and facing certain death, the survivors made the agonizing decision to eat the bodies of their fallen companions in order to live. For 33 grueling days, the Forlorn Hope struggled through the snows. Of the 15 who had set out, only 7, 2 men and all 5 women, finally stumbled, emaciated and frostbitten, into an Indian village on the western side of the mountains. They had made. The news of the trapped party sent a shockwave through the small American settlements in California. A series of rescue parties were hastily organized. The first relief party, led by 7 brave men, reached the Donner Lake camps in February. The scene that greeted them was one of pure horror. The snow was littered with the bodies of the dead. The survivors were skeletal,
their eyes wild with hunger and despair, many of them too weak to stand. The rescuers distributed what little food they had, and prepared to lead a group of the strongest, mostly the children, back out of the mountain. The journey back was another ordeal. 2 of the Reed children nearly perished in a blizzard, but were saved by the courage of one of the rescuers. Over the next 2 months, 3 more relief parties would make the journey into the mountains, each one finding a scene more ghastly than the last, with clear evidence that the survivors at the camps had also resorted to cannibalism. The final relief party, arriving in April, found only 1 person left alive at the Donner Lake camp, Louis Kaysberg, surrounded by the dismembered remains of those who had died. Tamsin Donner, George Donner's wife, was one of the last to. Her husband was too sick with an infected hand to travel with the early relief parties. Tamsin, a devoted wife and schoolteacher, made the heartbreaking decision to send her 3 young daughters out with the rescuers while she stayed behind to care for her dying husband. She chose to die with him rather than abandon him. Her act of love and devotion was one of the few points of light in a story of profound darkness. Of the 87 members of the Donner Party who had taken the fateful shortcut, only 48 survived. The story of their ordeal became a national sensation, a gruesome cautionary tale that haunted the Westward Trail for years to come. It is a story of how a series of seemingly small decisions, born of ambition and impatience, can lead to catastrophic consequences. It is a story of human hubris, a tragic reminder that the wilderness does not suffer fools gladly. But it is also, in its own dark way, a story of human endurance, a chilling and unforgettable testament to the terrifying thinness of the veil that separates civilization from savagery, and the incredible, terrible things the human spirit will do to survive.
In the vast, sun-scorched emptiness of the Judean desert, overlooking the salt-encrusted shores of the Dead Sea, there rises a great, solitary rock. It stands like a titan's anvil, its flat top sheared off from the surrounding landscape by the deep chasms of ancient ravines. For centuries it was merely a feature of the desolate landscape, but in the 1st century before the Christian era, it was transformed into one of the most remarkable fortresses in the world. Its architect was Herod the Great, the ambitious, paranoid and brilliant client king of Judea. He named it Masada. Herod built Masada to be his ultimate refuge, a sanctuary against his many enemies, both foreign and domestic. It was a masterpiece of defensive engineering and lavish design. Atop the wind-swept plateau he constructed massive storehouses, capable of holding enough food and wine to sustain 1,000 people for years. He engineered a sophisticated system of aqueducts and rock-hewn cisterns to capture and store precious rainwater, making the desert fortress an oasis of self-sufficiency. And on the northern cliff face, cascading down 3 terraces in defiance of gravity itself, he built a luxurious private villa, adorned with mosaic floors and painted frescoes, a place of comfort and beauty in the heart of an unforgiving wilderness. Masada was more than a fortress. It was a statement of power, a seemingly impregnable bastion floating in the sky. A century after Herod's death, the land he had ruled erupted in flame. The Great Jewish Revolt against the Roman Empire began, a furious and desperate struggle for religious and political freedom. After 4 years of brutal warfare, the revolt was crushed. In the year 70, the Roman legions, under the command of Titus, conquered Jerusalem and destroyed its magnificent Second Temple, the heart of the Jewish faith. The rebellion was over, its armies scattered, its holy city a smoking ruin. But the spirit of resistance was not entirely extinguished. A small band of the most zealous Jewish rebels, known as the Sicarii or Dagger Men, managed to escape the final destruction. Led by a man named Eleazar ben Yair, they made their way through the desert to the one place they knew they could hold out against the might of Rome, Masada. They seized the fortress from its small Roman garrison and established it as the last stronghold of Jewish defiance. For 2 years this small community of rebels and their families, numbering just under 1,000 people, lived atop the rock. They were an island of resistance in a sea of Roman power, a galling symbol of an unfinished war. For the Roman Empire, such defiance, however small and isolated, could not be tolerated. The presence of this rebel fortress was an affront to the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which was in reality a peace maintained by the constant threat of the sword. In the year 73, the Roman governor of Judea, Lucius Flavius Silva, marched his army into the desert with a single objective: to erase this final pocket of resistance from the map. The force Silva brought to bear was a testament to the seriousness of his mission. He came with the entire 10th Roman Legion, the Legio Dax Fretensis, a veteran unit that had been instrumental in the capture of Jerusalem. They were accompanied by thousands of auxiliary troops, and a vast number of Jewish prisoners of war, who would be used for manual labor. The logistical challenge was immense. To sustain an army of some 15,000 people in the barren desert required a supply chain of staggering complexity. But the Roman war machine was nothing if not efficient. First, Silva's army completely surrounded the base of the Great Rock. They constructed a wall of circumvallation, a siege wall nearly 7 miles long, studded with guard towers and camps. This wall sealed off any possibility of escape for the defenders and cut them off from the outside world. The Eagle of the 10th Legion had landed, and it would not leave until its work was done. The siege of Masada was not to be a battle of quick, violent assaults. The cliffs were too high, the defenses too strong. It was to be a slow, methodical, and inexorable display of Roman engineering might. The defenders on top could watch as the tiny figures of the Roman soldiers and their prisoners began a project of almost unimaginable labor. Silva had identified a single potential weakness in the fortress's natural defenses, a large white rock promontory on the western side that rose to within a few hundred feet of the summit. It was here that he would build his road to victory. He ordered the construction of a massive assault ramp. For months, under the blistering desert sun, thousands of men worked. They hauled earth, stone and timber, slowly, painstakingly building a great causeway against the side of the cliff. It was a monument to Roman persistence, a mountain being built by men to conquer a mountain of nature. The Sicarii on top of Masada could only watch this relentless advance. They would hurl down rocks and shoot arrows at the workers below, but they could do little to stop the ramp from growing higher, day by day, creeping ever closer to their wall. Finally, after months of labor, the great ramp was complete. It rose over 300 feet, a sloping highway to the gates of the fortress. Now the final phase of the siege could begin. The Romans constructed a great iron-sheathed siege tower, 60 feet high, and hauled it up the ramp. Within this tower were archers and stone throwers, and at its base a massive battering ram, a great iron-headed beam designed to pound the fortress walls into submission. The ram was brought to bear, and its rhythmic, percussive blows began to echo across the desert. The stone wall of Masada, which had stood for over a century, began to crack and crumble. But the defenders had prepared a surprise. Behind the stone wall they had built a second, inner wall, constructed of wooden beams and packed earth. This ingenious defense absorbed the shock of the battering ram, the soft earth deadening its blows. Silva, seeing his ram rendered ineffective, changed tactics. He ordered his soldiers to throw burning torches onto the wooden wall. The dry timber quickly caught fire. At first a strong wind blew from the north, driving the flames back towards the Romans, and the defenders let out a cheer, seeing it as a sign of divine favor. But then, as the historian Flavius Josephus would later write, as if God himself had changed his mind, the wind suddenly shifted and began to blow from the south, fanning the flames and sending them directly into the heart of the fortress, consuming the defensive wall. The breach was now open. The clear path into Masada would be ready by morning. The Romans, confident of their victory, retired to their camps for the night, intending to make their final assault at dawn. Inside the fortress, the defenders knew the end had come. They could expect no mercy from the Romans. For the men, capture meant a brutal death in the gladiatorial arenas or crucifixion. For the women and children, it meant a life of slavery and degradation. On this final desperate night, their leader, Eleazar ben Yair, gathered all 960 of the fortress's inhabitants. He delivered, according to the account of Josephus, 2 powerful and impassioned speeches. He did not call for a suicidal last stand against the might of the legion. Instead, he argued for a different kind of victory. He spoke of Roman cruelty and the horrors of slavery. He reminded them of their commitment to freedom, a commitment for which they had fought for so long. It was better, he argued, to die as free people, by their own hands, than to live as slaves under their enemy. Death was not a defeat, but a liberation of the soul, a final defiant act of freedom. Let us die before we become slaves under our enemies, he declared, and let us go out of the world as free men in company with our wives and children. His speech was met with tears and sorrow, but his logic was inescapable. They had reached a point where the only choice was between the manner of their death. He had convinced them they would not surrender their freedom. What followed was one of the most haunting and tragic acts in human history. The men of Masada prepared to carry out their terrible resolution. They embraced their wives and children one last time, weeping, but firm in their purpose. Then each man became the executioner of his own family. After this horrific task was done, the men gathered together all their possessions and set them on fire. They would deny the Romans any plunder, save for their food stores, which they left untouched, as a final testament that they had not died of starvation, but by choice. Then they drew lots. 10 men were chosen to kill the remaining husbands and fathers,
When this was done, the 10 drew lots, one last time. One man was chosen. His final terrible duty was to kill the other 9. And then, after surveying the silent scene to ensure that not a soul was left alive to fall into Roman hands, he took his own life. The next morning the Roman soldiers, shields locked and swords drawn, advanced through the breach, expecting a fierce and bloody fight. Instead, they were met with a profound and eerie silence. They shouted, hoping to draw out the defenders, but only silence answered. As they moved deeper into the fortress, they discovered the truth. They found not warriors ready for battle, but the bodies of 960 men, women and children, lying peacefully among the smoldering ruins. It was a scene not of victory, but of an awful silent tragedy. The only survivors were 2 women and 5 small children, who had hidden themselves in one of the underground water cisterns, and had lived to tell the tale to the Romans. The fall of Masada marked the final end of the great Jewish revolt. For the Romans it was a minor footnote, the cleanup of a stubborn rebellion in a remote province. But over the centuries the story of Masada has grown into a powerful and enduring symbol. It is a testament to the human desire for freedom, a story of defiance against impossible odds. It remains a place of pilgrimage, a stark and beautiful monument to the terrible choices that people are forced to make when all they have left to defend is the idea of liberty itself.
In the first years of the 19th century, the United States of America was a young republic with a boundless imagination and a very finite map. Its western border was the Mississippi River, and beyond that lay a vast, mysterious territory held by foreign powers. But the nation was led by a man whose mind was as expansive as the continent itself. President Thomas Jefferson was a product of the Enlightenment, a scholar, a scientist, and a visionary who dreamed of a republican empire stretching from sea to shining sea. In 1803 that dream took a giant leap toward reality. In a stunning act of diplomacy, Jefferson's envoys purchased the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon's France, doubling the size of the United States overnight for the bargain price of $15 million. With the stroke of a pen, America had acquired some 820,000 square miles of land, a territory whose geography, resources, and inhabitants were almost entirely unknown. For Jefferson this was an irresistible opportunity. He had long planned an expedition to the west, and now it had a new and profound urgency. He envisioned a corps of discovery that would venture into this new American wilderness. Their mission was multifaceted: to find a water route to the Pacific Ocean, the fabled Northwest Passage, for the purposes of commerce, to establish peaceful trade and diplomatic relations with the Native American tribes who lived there, and to conduct a sweeping scientific survey, documenting the plants, animals, geography and climate of this unknown land. To lead this monumental undertaking, Jefferson chose his own private secretary, a young army captain named Meriwether Lewis. Lewis was an ideal choice. He was intelligent, literate, and a keen observer of the natural world. He was also a man of immense courage and determination, though prone to dark moods of melancholy, what Jefferson called his sensible attachments to life. To prepare him, Jefferson sent him to Philadelphia, the nation's scientific capital, for a crash course with the country's leading experts in botany, zoology, medicine, and celestial navigation. Lewis knew he could not lead the expedition alone. He needed a co-commander, a man of practical frontier skills to complement his own scientific mind. He wrote to his old army friend, William Clark. Clark was a superb frontiersman, an expert boatman, a gifted cartographer, and a steady, pragmatic leader. He accepted the offer immediately. The 2 men possessed a deep mutual respect and trust that would prove essential to the success of their long journey. Though the army refused to grant Clark a captain's commission, Lewis insisted on sharing command equally, and to the men of the expedition, they were always Captain Lewis and Captain Clark. They spent the winter of 1803 near St. Louis, assembling their team and preparing for the journey. They hand-picked a crew of hardy young soldiers and skilled Kentucky frontiersmen. This group, the Corps of Discovery, was a microcosm of the young, rugged republic. They were disciplined, resourceful, and capable of immense endurance. Their preparations were meticulous. They packed scientific instruments, camping gear, medical supplies, and weapons. A significant portion of their cargo consisted of gifts for the Native American tribes they would encounter: peace medals bearing President Jefferson's image, tobacco, tools, beads, and mirrors. Their primary vessel was a custom-designed 55-foot keelboat, a sturdy craft that could be sailed, rowed, or poled, which would have to be pushed and pulled up the most powerful river on the continent. In May of 1804, the expedition set off from its camp and entered the churning muddy waters of the Missouri River. The journey had begun. The first leg was a grueling test of strength and will. The Missouri was a wild, unpredictable river, its powerful current filled with sandbars and submerged logs called sawyers. The men spent their days in back-breaking labor, rowing, poling, and often wading in the chest-deep water, hauling the heavy keelboat upriver with tow rope. It was a slow, agonizingly difficult advance, often covering only a few miles a day. As they moved deeper into the continent, the landscape transformed into the Great Plains, a vast rolling sea of grass that seemed to stretch to infinity. They entered a world teeming with wildlife on a scale that astounded them. They saw immense herds of bison that numbered in the thousands, vast congregations of elk, deer and pronghorn antelope. They also encountered a creature of immense power and ferocity, the grizzly bear, which they soon learned was a far more formidable adversary than any they had known back east. Their mission was also one of diplomacy. They held their first formal council with the Oto and Missouri tribes, where Lewis and Clark would perform a carefully choreographed ritual. They would march in full-dress uniform, deliver a formal speech announcing that the land now belonged to a new great father in Washington, present the chiefs with peace medals, and demonstrate the power of American technology, particularly Lewis's powerful air rifle, which could fire multiple shots without smoke or powder. The journey was not without hardship. The men were plagued by mosquitoes, boils, and illness. In August, the expedition suffered its first and only death. Sergeant Charles Floyd, a popular young member of the Corps, fell violently ill with what was likely a ruptured appendix. Lewis, with his limited medical training, could do nothing. Floyd was buried on a bluff overlooking the river, a solitary grave deep in the heart of the new American territory. As the autumn of 1804 approached, the expedition reached the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples, in what is now North Dakota. These were not nomadic tribes, but sophisticated agriculturalists, living in large, permanent earth lodge villages. The Corps of Discovery knew they could not cross the Great Mountains to the west before winter. They built a small triangular fort, which they named Fort Mandan, and prepared to spend the next 5 months as guests of their Native American hosts. This winter at Fort Mandan was a crucial turning point for the expedition. It was a period of intense cultural exchange. The Mandan and Hidatsa were welcoming and curious. Clark, with his skill for map-making, would spend hours with the chiefs, gathering invaluable information about the geography of the lands that lay ahead, drawing maps in the sand of the Great River and the towering snow-capped mountains that lay beyond it. It was here, among the Mandan, that they made the single most important addition to their party. They hired a French-Canadian fur trader named Toussaint Charbonneau to serve as an interpreter. Charbonneau himself was of limited use, but his young wife was invaluable. She was a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea. As a young girl, she had been captured by a Hidatsa raiding party and had been sold or gambled away to Charbonneau. She was barely a teenager and was pregnant with her first child, but she spoke Shoshone, the language of the people who lived in the mountains and from whom the expedition desperately needed to acquire horses. Sacagawea, with her infant son Jean-Baptiste, whom Clark would affectionately nickname Pomp, would become an indispensable member of the Corps, not just as an interpreter, but as a guide, a forager, and a powerful symbol of the expedition's peaceful intention. A war party, it was reasoned, did not travel with a woman and a baby. In the spring of 1805, the ice on the Missouri broke. Lewis and Clark sent the big keelboat back downriver, carrying a shipment for President Jefferson that was a testament to their work so far. Detailed maps, scientific specimens including live prairie dogs, and their journal. The permanent party, now numbering 33, continued west in smaller canoes, heading into a territory completely unknown to white men. The challenges grew more immense. They came to the Great Falls of the Missouri, a series of 5 massive waterfalls that required a month-long 18-mile portage over rocky cactus-covered ground. The men, battered by hailstorms and tormented by grizzly bears, had to haul their heavy canoes and tons of supplies overland. It was an ordeal that tested them to the limits of their endurance. Pressing on, they finally reached the headwaters of the Missouri River. It was a moment of both triumph and profound disappointment. The river they had followed for over 2,000 miles had dwindled to a small stream that Lewis could stand astride. Before them rose the great, terrifying wall of the Rocky Mountains. Jefferson's dream of an easy water route to the Pacific, a Northwest Passage, was a fiction. They would have to cross the mountains on foot. Their survival now depended entirely on finding the Shoshone and acquiring horses. Lewis scouted ahead, and after several tense days, he finally made contact with a band of Shoshone warriors. In one of the most remarkable coincidences in the history of exploration, the chief of this band, a man named Kamawit, turned out to be Sacagawea's own brother. The reunion was emotional and powerful. This incredible stroke of luck secured the horses and likely saved the expedition from complete disaster. With Shoshone guides, they began the final harrowing crossing of the Bitterroot Mountains. It was a nightmare. An early autumn snowstorm blanketed the trail. The men dressed in simple leather were freezing and starving. They were reduced to eating their horses, and then candles, and then the broth from their boiled moccasins. Finally, after 11 days of near starvation, they descended from the mountains, frost-bitten and emaciated, into the homeland of the Nez Perce tribe, who took them in and saved them from starvation. From here, the journey was downstream. Aided by the Nez Perce, they built new dugout canoes and began the final leg of their journey, down the Clearwater, the Snake, and finally the Great Columbia River. In November of 1805, after a year and a half of travel across an entire continent, William Clark dipped his pen in ink and wrote the immortal words in his journal, "Ocean in view, oh, the joy." They had reached the Pacific Ocean. They built a small fort, Fort Clatsop, near the mouth of the Columbia River, and endured a miserable, cold, and relentlessly rainy winter. In the spring of 1806, they began their long journey home. On the return trip, the party split up to explore more of the territory, with Lewis exploring the Marias River and Clark exploring the Yellowstone. After a brief, violent encounter with a party of Blackfeet warriors, the only such incident of the entire journey, the party was reunited on the Missouri River. Now, with the powerful current at their backs, they made rapid progress. On September 23, 1806, 2 years and 4 months after they had departed, the Corps of Discovery paddled into St. Louis. The people of the town were astounded. The expedition had been gone for so long that they had been given up for dead. They returned as heroes who had walked to the edge of the continent and back. They had not found the Northwest Passage, but their achievement was monumental. They had traveled over 8,000 miles, charting a path to the Pacific. They had established peaceful contact with dozens of Native American tribes. They had produced hundreds of detailed maps that would guide the next generation of American pioneers. And they had brought back a treasure trove of scientific and ethnographic knowledge, a detailed portrait of the American West in its pristine state. The Lewis and Clark expedition was the foundational epic of American exploration, a journey of courage, leadership and endurance that opened up a continent, not yet to settlement, but to the American imagination.
In the spring of 1942, the sun of the Japanese Empire seemed to be at its zenith, casting a long, triumphant shadow across the Pacific. 6 months had passed since the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and in that time, the forces of Japan had achieved an unbroken string of stunning victories. They had conquered the Philippines, seized the great British fortress of Singapore, swept through the resource-rich Dutch East Indies, and now threatened Australia and India. The Japanese Navy, particularly its powerful carrier strike force, the Kido Botai, seemed an invincible juggernaut, its veteran pilots and superior Zero fighters unmatched in the sky. For the United States, these were the darkest days of the war. The American Pacific Fleet was a wounded giant, its battleship row a graveyard of twisted metal at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Its only remaining offensive power lay in its aircraft carriers, which by a stroke of immense fortune, had been out at sea on the day of the attack. Upon this handful of ships, and the courage of the men who sailed and flew from them, rested the entire defense of the Pacific. The new American commander, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, a calm, steady Texan, faced the daunting task of holding a defensive line that stretched for thousands of miles, with a force that was vastly outnumbered and outgunned. In these desperate times, America needed a symbol of defiance, a sign that it was not beat. That sign came in April of 1942, in the form of one of the most audacious raids in military history. 16 American B-25 bombers, larger than any plane ever to fly from a carrier, struggled off the pitching deck of the USS Hornet. The Doolittle raid was a one-way mission. The planes did not have enough fuel to return. After dropping their bombs on Tokyo and other cities, the crews were to fly on to China. The physical damage of the raid was negligible, but its psychological impact was immense. In America, it was a desperately needed jolt of morale, proof that the nation could strike back. In Japan, it caused profound shock and humiliation. The emperor's sacred homeland had been violated. The man who felt this dishonor most keenly was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant and complex commander of the combined fleet, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. The raid convinced him that his strategy had been incomplete. He had not destroyed the American carriers, the very ships that had made the raid possible. He became obsessed with the need to lure the American fleet into one final decisive battle, an ambush that would annihilate them completely and secure Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific for years to come. Yamamoto devised a plan of immense scale and breathtaking complexity. The target for his operation was a tiny strategically vital speck of sand and coral in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Midway Atoll. Midway was America's westernmost outpost, a stationary aircraft carrier from which planes could threaten the Japanese flank and guard the approaches to Hawaii. Yamamoto's plan was to invade and occupy Midway. He knew the Americans could not allow the atoll to fall, and they would be forced to send their carriers to defend it. And there the trap would be sprung. Yamamoto would commit nearly his entire navy to the operation. A fleet of over 150 ships, divided into multiple forces converging on Midway from different directions. The vanguard would be the powerful carrier force, the Kido Botai, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagamo, with its 4 veteran carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the very ships that had devastated Pearl Harbor. They would neutralize Midway's defense. When the American carriers arrived to counterattack, Nagamo's force would be waiting to destroy them. Following behind, Yamamoto himself, aboard the super battleship Yamato, would lead the main force of battleships to mop up any remaining resistance. The plan was a masterpiece of naval strategy, but its great weakness was its very complexity. It depended on precise timing, perfect coordination between its scattered fleets, and above all, on the element of surprise. Yamamoto was certain the Americans had no idea what was coming. He was wrong. Thousands of miles away, in a windowless stuffy basement at Pearl Harbor, a different kind of war was being fought. This was the home of Station Haipo, the U.S. Navy's combat intelligence unit. Its commander was a brilliant, eccentric, and often insubordinate officer named Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts, a motley crew of linguists and musicians, worked around the clock, fueled by coffee and sheer determination, trying to break the Japanese Navy's operational code, a complex cipher known as JN-25. By the spring of 1942, they had made significant progress. They could not read the Japanese messages perfectly, but they could decipher enough to get the gist, like reading a newspaper with half the words blacked out. In May, they began to pick up a flurry of signals indicating that a massive Japanese operation was imminent. They could identify the ships involved and the general timing, but the main objective was a mystery, designated only by the code letters AF. Rochefort and his team were convinced that AF was Midway. All the intelligence pointed to it, but intelligence officers in Washington disagreed, believing the target was in the South Pacific, or perhaps even the west coast of the United States. Admiral Nimitz was caught in the middle. He was inclined to trust Rochefort, his man on the scene, but he needed definitive proof before he could risk his precious few carriers. It was Rochefort who came up with an ingenious ruse to confirm his hunch. He knew that the Japanese monitored American communication. He instructed the garrison at Midway to send out a false message, in an easily breakable code, complaining that their freshwater distillation plant was broken. A few days later, the code breakers at Station Haipo intercepted a Japanese intelligence report. It stated that AF was short on fresh water. The trap had been sprung. Nimitz now knew, with certainty, where and when the hammer was going to fall. The element of surprise had passed from the hunter to the hunted. Nimitz was still catastrophically outnumbered. He had no battleships, and only 3 aircraft carriers to face Nagamo's 4, and one of those, the USS Yorktown, had been heavily damaged at the recent Battle of the Coral Sea, and was limping back to Pearl Harbor. But Nimitz now held the trump card, knowledge. He knew the enemy's plan, their target, and their timetable. He decided to gamble everything on this intelligence. In a Herculean effort, the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard worked around the clock to repair the Yorktown. What was estimated to be a 3-month repair job was completed in under 3 days. The ship was patched up, its flight deck repaired, and it was sent back to sea, a testament to the desperate urgency of the moment. Nimitz placed his carriers under the command of Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Spruance was not an aviator. He was a cruiser commander, known for his calm, analytical mind. He was a late replacement for the aggressive and beloved Admiral Bull Halsey, who had been hospitalized with a severe skin condition. It was another stroke of fortune. Spruance's cool, intellectual temperament would be perfectly suited to the complex battle ahead. The 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the resurrected Yorktown, steamed out of Pearl Harbor and set a course for a point northeast of Midway, a place they called Point Luck. They were an ambush force, lying in wait for the ambushers. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the battle began. Just as Rochefort had predicted, the first wave of Japanese carrier planes appeared in the skies over Midway Atoll, bombing its airfield and installation. The American fighters based on the island rose to meet them and were cut to pieces by the superior Japanese Zeros. The attack did significant damage, but it did not knock out the airfield.
Aboard his flagship, the Akagi, Admiral Nagamo received the report from his strike leader. A second attack on Midway would be necessary. He had held his second wave of planes in reserve, armed with torpedoes, in case any American ships were sighted. But his scouts had reported nothing. Believing the seas were empty, Nagamo made a fateful decision. He ordered his crews to rearm the second wave of planes, to swap their torpedoes for land attack bombs for another strike on the island. This was a slow, difficult process. The planes had to be lowered to the hangar deck, the torpedoes removed and the bombs loaded. And it was at this moment that his carefully laid plans began to unravel. First, a belated report arrived from a scout plane. An American carrier had been sighted. Then another. Nagamo was stunned. The Americans were here, where they were not supposed to be. He immediately reversed his previous order. The planes were to be rearmed again, back to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The hangar decks of the Japanese carriers descended into a state of organized chaos. Ordnance carts, bombs, torpedoes, and fuel hoses littered the deck. The planes from the first strike on Midway began to return, needing to land and refuel. Nagamo was caught at the moment of maximum vulnerability, his flight decks crowded and chaotic, unable to launch or land aircraft effectively. It was at this precise moment that the first American carrier planes arrived. The attacks came in waves. First came the torpedo bombers from the Hornet and Enterprise. They came in low and slow, flying directly into a buzzsaw of anti-aircraft fire and swarming Zero fight. Their attack was a heroic, suicidal sacrifice. Almost all of them were shot down, without scoring a single hit, but their sacrifice was not in vain. In their desperate, low-level attack, they had drawn the entire Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the skies above the Japanese fleet completely undefended. And it was from those empty skies that salvation came. High above, the dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown had finally arrived over the target. Peeling off one by one, they tipped over into their near-vertical dives, the sound of their descent a terrifying shriek. On the decks of the Japanese carriers below, there was nothing to do but watch in horror. In the space of 5 fatal minutes, the course of the war in the Pacific was rewritten. The American bombs struck with devastating accuracy. The Kaga was hit and erupted in a series of massive explosions. The Saryu was hit next, its flight deck peeled back like a sardine can. Then the bombs struck Nagamo's flagship, the Akagi. The crowded, fuel-filled hangar decks turned the ships into colossal inferno. In a single stunning blow, 3 of the 4 veteran Japanese carriers were blazing, sinking wrecks. Only one remained, the Hiryu. Its commander launched a swift and courageous counterattack. His planes found the American carrier, Yorktown, and hit it with bombs and torpedoes, leaving it crippled and dead in the water. But the victory was short-lived. American scout planes located the Hiryu, and a final strike force was launched from the Enterprise. The dive bombers found their mark once more. The last of Nagamo's carriers was hit and left a burning hulk. The battle was over. In a single day, the heart of the Japanese carrier fleet had been destroyed. They had lost their 4 best carriers, and thousands of their most experienced pilots and aircrew, losses from which they would never recover. Hundreds of miles away, Admiral Yamamoto, his grand plan in ruins, was forced to accept the unbelievable reality of his defeat and order a general retreat. The Battle of Midway was the decisive turning point of the Pacific War. The seemingly unstoppable tide of Japanese expansion was not only halted, it was reversed. For the United States, it was a victory born from a desperate gamble, a victory made possible by the quiet, intellectual brilliance of the codebreakers, the calm, calculated courage of its commanders, and the incredible bravery of the pilots, who flew into the face of almost certain death. 6 months after its darkest hour at Pearl Harbor, the American Navy had achieved its greatest victory. The long road to Tokyo had begun.